History doesn't whisper here, it snarls. Nepal was never a quiet kingdom, hidden in the folds of the Himalayas. It was a blade, sharpened on stone, dripping with the weight of gods, blood, and conquest. The Kathmandu Valley was no peaceful cradle. It was a cauldron, boiling with rival kings, Malla lords clawing for power, temples rising like weapons aimed at the sky. Then came a storm wrapped in human form, Prithvi Narayan Shah. He did not march to unite. He marched to devour. Cities fell like prey beneath his soldiers' boots. Palaces collapsed under the crack of muskets. And in 1768, the valley gasped its final breath of independence. But the conquest was only the beginning. The East India Company, greedy eyes fixed on the mountains, tested Nepal's steel. The war burned, bodies piled, and the Treaty of Sugauli sliced Nepal apart, amputating her lands but leaving her spine unbroken. Then the night turned blacker. The Ranaku, a massacre so sudden it smelled of gunpowder and betrayal, chaining a nation for a century. Every throne cracked, every promise shattered. Bloodlines ended in gunfire, in shadows, in whispers behind Durbar walls. Nepal's history is not carved in stone. It is etched in scars, still bleeding beneath the mountains. The Himalayas rise like walls of stone and ice, but within their shadow lies a land that has never been merely a frontier. Nepal stands locked between two giants, India to the south, Tibet to the north, yet it has never been swallowed. Its geography shaped its survival. Its valleys became sanctuaries. Its mountains became barriers sharper than fortresses. Every pass, every gorge, every river defined the rhythm of its history. The Kathmandu Valley was the heart, a bowl of fertile land carved by ancient lakes, ringed by hills, watered by rivers like the Bagmati and Bishnamati. Archaeologists have traced human presence here back thousands of years. Stone tools, pottery fragments, inscriptions, proof that long before dynasties rose, people settled in this valley, drawn by its soil and its safety. It was not an isolated hollow. It was a corridor. Whoever controlled it controlled the pulse between the Indian plains and the Tibetan plateau. Trade routes stitched the valley into larger networks. Salt caravans from Tibet moved south. Grain, cotton, and spices from India moved north. Traders paused in Kathmandu to rest, barter, and leave traces of cultures behind. With them came religions, Hinduism flowing up from the Ganges basin, Buddhism crossing down from Lhasa. They did not clash. They entwined, leaving temples and stupas side by side. By the first millennium BCE, Nepal was already more than a crossroads. It was a melting ground of gods and merchants, kings and pilgrims. The valley's geography made it a prize, but also a cage. Surrounded by ridges, it could be defended with astonishing ease. Armies from outside would struggle to penetrate narrow passes. Local rulers understood this advantage well. Whoever held the hilltop fortresses could choke off access to the valley floor. Control meant not only harvest from fertile fields, but tolls from every caravan that passed through. This monopoly on trade turned rulers into wealthy patrons of art, architecture, and ritual. Beyond the valley, settlements spread through the hills and Himalayan foothills. In the Terai, the lowland belt bordering India, fertile soil fed dense populations. Ancient texts reference these regions. The Ramayana speaks of Videha, Mithila, lands once tied closely to present-day Nepal's southern plains. This Terai zone acted as a cultural bridge. Kings of northern India married into families there. Trade routes ran through its forests, carrying iron, copper, and rice. It was here near Lumbini that Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, was born around the 6th century BCE. The very geography of Nepal linked it forever to one of history's most transformative figures. Moving north, the Himalayan passes opened onto Tibet. Harsh, steep, and treacherous, they were not impassable. For centuries, caravans carried salt from Tibetan mines across frozen trails to trade for rice and metals from the south. These exchanges were not small. They fueled entire economies. Kathmandu Valley rulers grew rich not by producing all goods themselves, but by taxing and controlling their flow. Geography made Nepal not an isolated mountain enclave, but a broker between two civilizations. The significance of this geography was felt during the rise of the Lichavi dynasty in the 4th century CE. From inscriptions carved into stone pillars and temple walls, historians know these rulers understood their kingdom's value as a meeting ground. They built irrigation canals to make the fertile valley produce more grain. They invested in roads and rest houses for travelers. They minted coins, some modeled after Indian styles, others reflecting Tibetan trade. The valley's position forced them to be cosmopolitan. They absorbed influences from Gupta India, Sanskrit inscriptions, Hindu deities, and blended them with Buddhist traditions from the north. The land itself demanded this fusion. The hills and valleys held shrines to Shiva alongside Chaityas for the Buddha. Pilgrims from across Asia stopped here. Chinese travelers like Xuanzang in the 7th century wrote of Nepal as a kingdom where both religions flourished, its kings patrons of monasteries as well as temples. None of this was coincidence. The Kathmandu Valley was fertile enough to sustain dense settlements, wealthy enough to support cultural projects, and secure enough to protect them. Geography did not only feed the people, it shaped their worldview. Even the myths of Nepal tie back to the land. Ancient legends say the valley was once a vast lake. The Bodhisattva Manjushri is said to have cut through the surrounding hills with his sword, draining the waters and making the valley habitable. Archaeology supports parts of this myth. Geologists confirm that the valley was indeed once filled with a lake in prehistoric times, gradually drained through natural erosion of river channels. Myth became memory. Memory became history. The land itself was the storyteller. To the west and east, hill kingdoms rose in isolation. Each valley carved into the mountains created small polities with their own rulers, dialects, and loyalties. But always the Kathmandu Valley remained the magnet. Wealthier, more connected, more envied. Its architecture reflected its centrality. Temples built during the Lichavi and later the Malla period did not merely copy Indian styles. They created a unique Newar synthesis, pagoda-style temples that would later influence Tibetan and even Chinese architecture. Again, geography mattered. Only in a land where merchants, monks, and kings converged could such hybrid forms take root. The mountains also acted as shields. Nepal's location ensured that unlike much of northern India, it was never fully absorbed into the great empires, the Maurya, the Gupta, the Mughals. The Himalayas stood as guardians. Armies could not sustain themselves across the passes. The fertile valley was defensible. Rulers of Nepal often paid tribute to more powerful neighbors, but their geography allowed them to retain sovereignty where others were annexed. Independence was not just a political achievement, it was a geographical condition. Yet this geography was also unforgiving. The very mountains that kept Nepal safe also kept it isolated. Communications were slow. Unifying the hill regions under one authority was difficult. The valley thrived, but distant settlements remained fragmented. Unity was always fragile. Geography both protected and divided. By the time the Mallas controlled the Kathmandu Valley in the 12th century, the geography again determined their fate. The valley was wealthy enough to sustain three rival capitals, Kathmandu, Patan, Bhaktapur, each competing in art, architecture, and political intrigue. The land could feed them all. The trade routes could enrich them all. Yet their proximity bred rivalry. The valley that united Nepal with the world also fractured its internal politics. Every line of Nepal's history, from ancient settlement to royal rivalry, bends back to the same reality, the land. The Himalayas were never just mountains. The valleys were never just fields. They were engines of survival, theaters of power, bridges of exchange. Geography was not the background of Nepal's story. It was the story itself. The origins of Nepal were never written on paper first. They were carved into stone, sung in ritual, and preserved in legend. At the heart of it all stands the tale of a valley that was once a lake. The Kathmandu Valley, today dense with cities and shrines, was in antiquity remembered as a body of water so vast no settlement could exist within. The myth speaks of Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, who gazed upon a lotus blooming in the middle of this lake. He is said to have drawn his sword of flame and cut through the hills at Chobar, releasing the waters and leaving behind fertile land. Modern geology confirms part of this memory. Sediment layers in the valley prove that a prehistoric lake once covered it, draining through erosion thousands of years ago. Myth and science converge, showing that even the oldest stories carry a residue of truth. The drained valley became habitable, and human footprints soon followed. Archaeological findings, tools, pottery shards, burial sites show settlement from prehistoric times. By the first millennium BCE, structured communities already existed. The valley's soil was rich, its rivers abundant, its hills defensible. This was more than geography, it was destiny. The valley would become a crucible where religion, power, and culture fused into something distinctively Nepali. From the 4th century CE, the Lichavi dynasty began shaping this destiny into political form. Their earliest known inscription, dated 464 CE and attributed to King Manadeva, stands at Changanarayan, the oldest surviving Hindu temple in the valley. This was not just a marker of kingship, it was a declaration of continuity, proving that organized monarchy, written law, and religious patronage had arrived. For centuries, these rulers left stone inscriptions across the valley. Each one recorded land grants, donations to temples, administrative decisions. These were not empty records. They mapped the foundations of Nepali identity. The Lichavi rulers inherited a world already rich in belief. Hinduism had flowed north from the Ganges basin, carried by priests, merchants, and migrating clans. Buddhism had traveled south from Tibet and east from the ancient Indian heartlands of Magadha and Kosala. In Nepal, they did not cancel each other out, they overlapped. Kings sponsored Vishnu temples and Buddhist monasteries alike. The people moved between shrines without conflict. Archaeological remains confirm this coexistence. At Swayambhunath, the great Buddhist stupa, Lichavi kings added inscriptions praising both the Buddha and Hindu gods. At Pashupatinath, the holiest Hindu shrine, Buddhist imagery also appeared. The valley's religious life was not fractured, it was woven. The blending was also political. By honoring both faiths, the Lichavi kings unified a diverse population. Sanskrit became the language of official inscriptions, a clear influence from Gupta India. But local Newar culture shaped the rituals and architecture. The pagoda-style multi-tiered roofs, elaborately carved struts, began to appear, later traveling from Nepal into Tibet and China. This was not borrowed wholesale from India. It was a Nepali creation, forged by artisans in a valley where trade and faith demanded hybrid forms. The Lichavi period also tied Nepal to global networks. The Silk Road was not one road, but a web of routes, and the passes north of the valley linked into it. Traders from Lessa brought salt, wool, and gold dust. From the south came cotton, rice, and spices. Caravans paused in Kathmandu not just to exchange goods, but to exchange ideas. Coins from India circulated alongside Tibetan measures of salt. Buddhist monks traveling between Nalanda in India and monasteries in Tibet stopped to teach and pray. Hindu pilgrims traveling toward Pashupatinath paid tribute to the kings along the way. The valley thrived because it was never sealed, it was porous. Religious coexistence left lasting marks on social order. Caste distinctions, influenced by Hindu law, became more formalized under the Lichavis. Inscriptions mention Brahmins receiving land grants, showing their growing importance in administration and ritual. At the same time, Buddhist monasteries received royal patronage, allowing monks to establish lasting institutions. Instead of choosing between traditions, the rulers reinforced both, building a society that carried dual identities at its core. The myths themselves reflect this duality. The tale of Manjushri draining the lake is Buddhist in origin, but it did not prevent Hindu kings from honoring it. The valley was understood as sacred regardless of the frame of reference. Every hill was a shrine, every spring a tirtha. Religious space was shared, overlapping, and contested only in rare moments. For the majority of Lichavi rule, The strength of Nepal lay in this ability to contain contradictions. The material remains of the period confirm the power of this synthesis. Stone sculptures from the Lichavi age show both Vishnu reclining on the serpent Ananta and bodhisattvas in meditative poses. Temples such as Kathmandu Narayan carry inscriptions praising Hindu gods while adopting artistic motifs drawn from Buddhist traditions. These artifacts are not fragments of separate cultures. They are proof of fusion. The valley became a stage where multiple traditions could survive because geography demanded inclusivity. No single faith could dominate entirely, not when trade routes and migrant communities kept new influences flowing in. By the 7th century, Nepal was recognized beyond its borders as a place of significance. Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, traveling through the Indian subcontinent, described it as a land where both Buddhism and Hinduism were honored, its rulers pious, and its people prosperous. Such outside accounts matter. They show that Nepal was not hidden. It was known, connected, acknowledged as a participant in wider Asian culture. The Lichavi kings continued to strengthen their rule until the 9th century. But even as dynasties shifted, the foundations laid during their reign endured. The valley remained a land defined by its origin myths, its coexistence of religions, its hybrid architecture, and its central role in trade. The draining of the lake by Manjushri was more than legend, it was metaphor. It symbolized transformation, the turning of water into land, chaos into order, myth into history. And in that transformation, Nepal's earliest identity took shape, raw and unshakable. The Lichavi kingdom was not born in silence. It carved itself into the stone of the Kathmandu Valley, announcing power with inscriptions that still stand today. Around the 4th century CE, a dynasty emerged that would give Nepal its first long-lasting political structure. Their voices were not written on paper that could burn. They were etched in stone, leaving behind pillars, tablets, and temple walls that spoke of kings, battles, and gods. The earliest known record dates to 464 CE, when King Manadeva ordered an inscription at Kathmandu Narayan, a temple that still towers above the valley. That single stone was more than a dedication to a deity. It was a declaration that a dynasty had matured into authority. Manadeva's reign stretched into the late 5th century, and during his rule the valley took on a sharper shape. Organized villages, cultivated fields, irrigation systems, tax structures, and expanding trade routes. Urban planning was no accident. The Kathmandu Valley had always been fertile, but the Lichavis turned fertility into a system. They built canals to direct rivers like the Bagmati and Bishnamati, ensuring consistent harvests that could sustain denser populations. Fields were divided, taxes collected, and the wealth redirected into temples and palaces. Archaeological studies confirm the spread of settlements during this era. Brick structures, drainage systems, and terraced fields marked a shift from scattered habitation to organized urbanism. Trade ran through the veins of this system. The valley was perfectly positioned between India and Tibet, and the Lichavis knew it. Caravans carrying salt wool and horses from the north passed through, while rice, grains, and metals came from the south. The rulers taxed this movement, growing rich not only from their soil, but from the goods flowing across their borders. Coins minted in the valley have been unearthed, some imitating Gupta models from India, others bearing uniquely Nepali inscriptions. They were symbols of sovereignty and instruments of commerce, proof that the Lichavi economy was integrated into larger networks. Art and architecture flourished under this wealth. Kathmandu Narayan Temple, dedicated to Vishnu, stands as the oldest surviving Hindu temple in Nepal, and its foundation stretches back to the Lichavi age. Carved stone reliefs there depict Vishnu in multiple forms: Narasimha, the man-lion, Vishvarupa, the cosmic form, and other avatars. These are not merely devotional pieces. They are masterworks of craftsmanship, evidence that artisans of the period had already achieved a sophisticated style blending Indian iconography with local innovation. But Hindu art was not alone. Buddhist monuments also grew under Lichavi patronage. The Great Stupa of Swayambhunath received additions, and inscriptions revealed donations to monasteries. Kings might have leaned toward Hinduism in their personal devotion, but politically they were patrons of both. By supporting Hindu priests and Buddhist monks, they reinforced their legitimacy across communities. The architecture itself reflected the hybrid identity of the valley. While Indian influence was strong, particularly from the Gupta Empire, the pagoda style that later defined Nepali architecture took root in this period. Wooden struts carved with divine figures, tiered roofs rising upward, and courtyards designed for both ritual and community life began to appear. This style spread beyond Nepal, influencing Tibetan and Chinese temple design in later centuries. The Lichavi kings were not imitators, they were innovators. Their political system gave structure to this flowering culture. The king stood at the top, often tracing legitimacy through divine descent. But inscriptions show a hierarchy of administrators beneath him. Feudal lords controlled territories, Brahmins received land grants, and tax officials ensured revenue. The term Samanta appears often in inscriptions, referring to feudatory chiefs who managed local areas while recognizing the authority of the king. This layered structure allowed the dynasty to hold together a valley filled with diverse populations. Law and order were enforced through dharmashastras or religious legal codes. Inscriptions detail fines, punishments, and grants of immunity, showing that the rulers saw themselves as protectors of social order as much as military leaders. Brahmins were elevated through land donations, reinforcing the caste hierarchy that had begun to crystallize. Yet Buddhist monks were also granted resources, showing again the dual patronage that defined this age. One striking feature of Lichavi inscriptions is their precision. They record exact dates in the Sake era, names of donors, boundaries of land, and specific uses for resources. These records were not ornamental. They were legal instruments meant to bind communities across generations. The stone was a contract. This practice has allowed historians to reconstruct Lichavi politics with rare clarity for such an early period. Military power underpinned it all. Manadeva himself is credited with suppressing internal revolts and expanding Lichavi authority into neighboring regions. Later rulers, such as Ashivarma in the 7th century, consolidated power even further, acting almost as kings in their own right despite not being of the central royal line. Ashivarma's reign, beginning in 605 CE, marked a high point in Lichavi governance. He issued his own inscriptions, maintained foreign relations, and promoted cultural growth. His support of both Hinduism and Buddhism reinforced the tradition of religious coexistence that defined the valley. Diplomatic ties extended beyond Nepal. Marriages connected Lichavi royalty to Tibetan rulers, and embassies traveled to China. Records from the Tang dynasty note the presence of Nepali envoys, proof that the valley was not isolated but part of larger Asian diplomacy. This outward reach was fueled by geography, but secured by organization. Without a stable administration, no kingdom could have maintained such ties. The Lichavi contribution to Nepal's identity cannot be overstated. Their system of inscriptions created a documented history. Their temples anchored religion in physical form. Their administration structured society around hierarchy and law. Their trade networks tied the valley to India, Tibet, and China. Their art and architecture gave visual shape to a culture at once Hindu and Buddhist, Indian-influenced, and uniquely Nepali. Even the myths of the valley were reshaped in their era. Manjushri's draining of the lake was celebrated not only in Buddhist texts, but reflected in Hindu traditions as well. The kings understood that myth was as important as law in binding their subjects. By honoring both traditions, they reinforced the sacred geography of the valley, turning it into a political asset as much as a spiritual one. The stones of Changa Narayan, the stupas of Swayambhunath, the scattered inscriptions across the valley. These were the fingerprints of the Lichavi dynasty. Each one whispered authority. Each one recorded a moment when kings anchored themselves not only in power, but in permanence. And through them, the Lichavi kingdom transformed Nepal from scattered settlements into a structured state, its voice carved into rock, still echoing across centuries. The Malla dynasty did not inherit a blank slate. It inherited a valley already shaped by the Lichavis, already marked by temples and trade routes. Yet from the 12th century onward, the Mallas pushed the Kathmandu Valley into an age so intense, so saturated with cultural output, that historians still call it Nepal's Golden Age. For nearly 6 centuries, from about 1200 to the late 18th century, they ruled, fought, built, and transformed the valley into a theater of brilliance and rivalry. The Mallas understood power through architecture. Kings did not merely rule, they constructed. Their cities became extensions of their authority. Kathmandu, Patan, and Bhaktapur rose as capitals, each boasting its own Durbar Square. These were not simple palaces. They were vast complexes of courtyards, shrines, water tanks, sculptures, and throne halls. Every carving, every statue, every gilded rooftop was a statement. Bhaktapur Durbar Square with its 55 windows palace, Patan's palace complex, with the famed Krishna Mandir of the 17th century, Kathmandu's Hanumandoka with its courtyards layered over centuries, all with the fingerprints of Malla ambition. The pagoda style matured fully under their patronage. Tiered wooden temples with sloping roofs, supported by carved struts depicting gods, goddesses, and mythical beasts, became the architectural language of the valley. The artistry of the Malla craftsmen reached astonishing refinement. Metal sculptures of deities cast in lost wax technique left the valley and traveled across Tibet and beyond. The Mallas transformed Newar artisanship into an international standard. But the Golden Age was not only stone and wood. It was literature, philosophy, and performance. The Mallas were prolific writers. They composed dramas in Sanskrit and the local Newar language. Court poetry flourished. Jayasthiti Malla, who ruled from 1382 to 1395, was not only a king, but a legislator and organizer. He is remembered for codifying Nepal's caste and legal system with meticulous detail. This was no vague decree, it was systematic classification, defining occupations, social boundaries, and legal responsibilities. For example, he set precise distinctions between priestly Brahmins, warrior Kshatriyas, merchants, artisans, and laboring castes. This codification was modeled on Indian Dharmashastra traditions, but adapted to the valley's unique social fabric. The caste system became deeply embedded, shaping Nepali society for centuries. Jayasthiti Malla also restructured the judicial system. He introduced penalties according to caste and crime, recorded in detail. Theft, adultery, violence, each carried a specific punishment scaled to the offender's social rank. This was harsh, but it was organized. It turned fragmented custom into codified law. In doing so, he left a blueprint of governance that later rulers followed. Art mirrored this order. The 15th century produced some of the most intricate paba paintings, scroll paintings depicting deities and mandalas. These were predecessors to Tibetan Thankas, but carried distinct Newar characteristics. Fine detail, bold colors, crowded iconography. Such works were not decoration. They were tools of meditation, teaching, and political legitimacy. Kings patronized them to assert piety and cultural supremacy. The rivalry between the 3 valley capitals fueled this cultural explosion. After the death of Yaksha Malla in 1482, his kingdom split among his sons into Kathmandu, Patan, and Bhaktapur. Instead of weakening the dynasty, this division set off a competition that filled the valley with monuments. Each city attempted to outshine the others with taller temples, grander palaces, and more festivals. Bhaktapur's Nyatapala Temple, completed in 1702, still stands as the tallest pagoda-style temple in Nepal, its 5 stories dwarfing all rivals. Patan's Krishna Mandir, built in 1637 under King City Narasimha Malla, broke with the wooden pagoda style and rose in stone, influenced by northern Indian shikara design, an assertion of innovation and wealth. Kathmandu's Talaju Bhavani Temple, consecrated in the 16th century, became a dynastic deity of the Mallas, its secretive rituals reinforcing royal power. Festivals became stages for authority. Indra Jatra in Kathmandu, Biska Jatra in Bhaktapur, Rado Mashindranath Chariot Festival in Patan. These were not just religious processions. They were political theater sponsored by kings, displaying the wealth of the court, the participation of the people, and the living link between monarchy and gods. The introduction of the living goddess Kumari, a practice formalized under the Mallas, made the connection explicit. The Kumari, chosen from a Newar Sakya family, was revered as the embodiment of Talaju and Durga. The king bowed before her annually, affirming his legitimacy as ruler under divine approval. The Mallas also built systems of water distribution, high-tie stone waterspouts, ponds, and canals that still function in parts of the valley today. These were practical projects, but they were also symbols of good kingship. A ruler who could provide water, food, and festivals was one who secured loyalty. Trade expanded under their rule. The valley remained a crucial node between India and Tibet. From Tibet came salt, wool, and gold. From India came cotton, grains, and precious goods. Newar merchants established lasting trade colonies in Tibet, carrying with them not only goods, but art and religion. Some of the finest Newar Buddhist artisans were commissioned to create works for Tibetan monasteries, spreading Malayalam aesthetics far beyond the valley. Diplomacy reflected this commercial web. Malla rulers maintained ties with the Mughal Empire in India and the Yuan and Ming dynasties in China. Gifts, embassies, and exchanges of artisans flowed across the mountains. The valley's rulers were small in territory compared to these empires, but their position gave them leverage. Geography turned into diplomacy, and diplomacy into cultural prestige. The Malla period also left behind chronicles, vaevals, dynastic records that combined history, legend, and genealogy. Though often infused with myth, these texts give crucial insight into how the Mallas saw themselves, heirs to both Hindu and Buddhist traditions, guardians of Dharma, and patrons of unmatched cultural life. Yet beneath the cultural brilliance lay tension. The caste system codified by Jayasthiti, Malla, hardened into social rigidity. Occupations became hereditary. Upward mobility constrained. Political division among the three capitals made the valley vulnerable. Rivalries that built temples also created weakness. By the 18th century, as the Mallas continued to compete in festivals and monuments, Prithvi Narayan Shah of Gorkha was preparing to strike. But until that moment, the Malla dynasty had already engraved 6 centuries of cultural magnificence into the valley stones, paintings, and laws. Every courtyard of the Durbar squares, every gilded roof, every pauba canvas, every legal inscription carries the imprint of their rule. The Kathmandu Valley of the Malla age was not a static kingdom. It was a living contest of kingship, art, law, and devotion, each element feeding the others in relentless intensity. When Yaksha Malla died in 1482, the great power of the Mallas fractured. His kingdom, once united under a single authority, split into pieces. Kathmandu became Kantipur, Patan became Lalitpur, Bhaktapur remained its own domain. 3 capitals, 3 crowns. Yet the valley was too small to sustain so much rivalry. What followed was not unity, but centuries of competition, suspicion, and intrigue. Each city fortified itself. Walls rose around Kantipur, Lalitpur, and Bhaktapur, each with its own palace complex, its own court, its own vision of power. Their kings shared bloodlines, culture, and religion, yet they treated one another as enemies. This was not just political fragmentation. It was rivalry etched into the very streets of the valley. Trade made the stakes higher. The Kathmandu Valley was a crossroads of Asia. To the north lay Tibet, with its salt, wool, gold, and demand for artisanship. To the south lay the plains of India, rich with cotton, grains, and access to wider markets. Whoever controlled the valley controlled this exchange. Newar merchants carried goods along the trans-Himalayan routes, their caravans moving across treacherous passes to Lhasa. The valley cities prospered on customs duties, tolls, and the flourishing of bazaars. But prosperity was never shared. It was hoarded, defended, and turned into rivalry. Bhaktapur held the advantage in size and resources. It was larger, agriculturally richer, and for a time politically dominant. Yet Kantipur, situated on major trade arteries, rapidly expanded its influence. Lalitpur, wedged between them, struggled to assert itself, but maintained power through alliances and cultural prestige. None could overwhelm the others completely. So war came in cycles. One city gained, another retaliated, and the balance shifted again. The rivalries shaped politics in ruthless ways. Kings formed alliances with Tibet or Mughal India, hoping to gain an upper hand. Envoys moved through the passes with gifts and promises. But dependence on foreign powers often deepened tensions rather than resolve them. Every diplomatic mission was a gamble. Strengthening trade ties with one neighbor could mean antagonizing another. The valley's artisans and merchants thrived in spite of the wars. The 16th and 17th centuries saw the expansion of Newar influence in Tibet. Newar traders set up permanent colonies in cities like Lhasa and Shagats, building temples and monasteries in their distinctive style. Their role was not only economic, but also cultural. They introduced Paba painting, bronze casting, and the pagoda temple form into Tibetan lands. In return, Tibetan patronage enriched the valley's workshops. But even this prosperity became a source of rivalry. Each kingdom wanted to claim dominance over the trade routes. Each built temples and monuments to display wealth drawn from caravans. The competition reached fever pitch during festivals. Indra Jatra in Kantapur, Biscuit Jatra in Bhaktapur, Rado Mashindranath Chariot Festival in Lalitpur. These became stages for kings to assert superiority. A chariot procession was not just religious, it was political theater, meant to show the might of a city's ruler and the devotion of his people. If a rival kingdom's emissary or merchant witnessed the spectacle, it was a display of wealth and cultural command. Yet instability remained constant. A city weakened by drought or famine became vulnerable to raids. Border disputes over farmland erupted into skirmishes. Political assassinations and palace coups added to the instability. Power was never secure. A king might reign for decades, but his heirs could be displaced in weeks. The legal systems codified under Jayasthiti Malla remained in place, but now functioned separately in each kingdom. Laws governing caste, property, and taxation were enforced within city boundaries, but beyond them, rival codes clashed. This lack of unified governance left the valley fractured in administration, as well as politics. By the 17th century, Kantapur gained prominence under King Pratap Malla, r. 1641 to 1674. His reign left indelible marks on Kathmandu. He expanded Hanuman Doka Palace, erected the stone inscription at Durbar Square in 15 languages, and commissioned religious shrines blending Hindu and Buddhist elements. He even built the Rani Pokhari, a water reservoir still standing today. Yet his ambitions to dominate the valley failed. Bhaktapur and Lalitpur resisted fiercely. The division of power persisted. The rivalry did not go unnoticed by outsiders. The Mughal Empire to the south and Tibet to the north both observed the valley's weakness. Still, the valley retained enough wealth to remain significant. Tibetan trade in particular made the kingdom's crucial intermediaries. When silver shortages hit Tibet, Newar merchants facilitated exchange with Indian markets. The coinage minted in the valley, such as the moher, circulated widely in the Himalayan region. Control over this minting was another source of power and another point of contention between the cities. Bhaktapur, proud and strong, remained deeply conservative, clinging to its agricultural wealth and religious traditions. Lalitpur, with its vibrant artisan community, remained a cultural beacon. Kantapur, politically aggressive and strategically located, pushed toward dominance, but never secured it fully. The three together formed a triangle of rivalry that locked the valley in a stalemate. Outside the valley, the hills and mountains were home to dozens of smaller kingdoms and principalities. Gorkha, Makwanpur, Lamjung, and others existed on the periphery, watching the valley struggles. While the Malla capitals consumed themselves in competition, these smaller states grew restless. Gorkha in particular, under King Ram Shah, 1606 to 1633, and his successors, developed military strength and administrative discipline. By the 18th century, this outside force would change everything. The valley kings were aware of the dangers, yet they remained trapped in their rivalries. Each feared the others more than they feared external threats. When Prithvi Narayan Shah began his campaigns in the mid-18th century, the valley was unprepared not because it lacked resources, but because it lacked unity. For centuries after Yaksha Malla's death, the Kathmandu Valley glowed with prosperity but burned with rivalry. Its palaces glittered, its trade routes thrived, its artisans created wonders. But its politics were fractured, its rulers divided, and its strength constantly undermined by internal wars. The fragmented kingdoms built, traded, and celebrated. Yet every gain carried the shadow of instability, every monument the weight of competition. In 1559, a throne was carved from ambition in a hilltop fortress that overlooked the valleys below. Dhruva Shah seized the small principality of Gorkha, a land perched on the mid-hills west of the Kathmandu Valley. He was not born to it. He wrested it from the hands of the Gurungs, enthroning himself with the backing of local nobles. From that moment, Gorkha was no longer a minor hill state. It became a seed of conquest. Dhruva Shah built the foundations carefully. He introduced a centralized authority where local chiefs had once ruled with autonomy. He created a disciplined administration and secured the loyalty of the Magar and Khaz clans, who formed the backbone of his army. He positioned Gorkha not only as a kingdom of warriors, but as a polity with ambition beyond its narrow borders. While the Mallas of the Kathmandu Valley fought among themselves, Gorkha strengthened in silence. By the 17th century, Gorkha had endured through successive kings. Ram Shah, ruling from 1606 to 1633, gave the kingdom a reputation for justice. His Ram Shah Ko Kara. The sayings of Ram Shah were remembered as guiding principles of fairness and governance. They became proverbs quoted across the hills, adding moral authority to Gorkha's rule. But justice was only one part of its strength. The kings who followed expanded territory slowly, measuring each step, waiting for the moment when the valley's rivalries could be turned to advantage. That moment came under Prithvi Narayan Shah, born in 1723, the son of King Nara Bhupal Shah. He inherited the throne of Gorkha in 1743 at the age of 20. Youth did not dull his vision, it sharpened it. He looked east toward the Kathmandu Valley, saw the fractured kingdoms of Kantipur, Lalitpur, and Bhaktapur, and recognized their weakness. While they paraded their wealth in temples and festivals, he studied their vulnerabilities. He believed that Gorkha's destiny lay not in remaining a hill principality, but in seizing the valley and uniting the lands into a single Nepal. Prithvi Narayan Shah's methods were not reckless charges, but careful calculations. He reorganized the army, emphasizing discipline and loyalty. He adopted new weapons, muskets and cannons procured from India, ensuring that his soldiers were not outmatched by the forces of the valley. He fortified Gorkha's hilltop strongholds, making them nearly impregnable to counterattacks. Each move was deliberate, each alliance measured. He also mastered politics through marriage. His alliances were sealed not only on the battlefield, but in family ties. By marrying into influential houses of neighboring states, he ensured that Gorkha would not be encircled by enemies. These political marriages gave him legitimacy and access to networks of support beyond his own kingdom. When war came, he would not stand alone. The campaign for unification began with relentless persistence. In 1744, Prithvi Narayan Shah captured Nuwakot, a strategic fort that controlled trade routes between Tibet and the Kathmandu Valley. The victory was more than territorial, it was symbolic. By seizing Nuwakot, he cut off the valley's economic arteries and announced Gorkha as a rising power. He fortified it immediately, using it as a base for further advances. From there, he turned to the surrounding hill states. One by one, he brought them under Gorkha's control, sometimes by force, sometimes by diplomacy. He understood the terrain, the psychology of his rivals, and the importance of timing. He rarely attacked without preparation, choosing instead to weaken enemies by blocking trade, intercepting supplies, or waiting until divisions among them opened an opportunity. The Kathmandu Valley kings underestimated him. They were absorbed in their rivalries, squabbling over precedence in festivals, competing in the embellishment of palaces, and seeking favors from Tibet and India. When Prithvi Narayan Shah laid siege to their cities, they realized too late that the hill king they had dismissed as a nuisance had become an existential threat. The sieges were brutal. Kantapur, Lalitpur, and Bhaktapur, encircled by Gorkha's forces, struggled against starvation. Trade routes were cut, granaries depleted. The valley's prosperity, once its pride, became its weakness. Cities dependent on commerce could not sustain long wars without external supply lines. Prithvi Narayan Shah understood this perfectly. His strategy was not to storm palaces recklessly, but to choke them slowly, forcing submission through exhaustion. Still, resistance was fierce. Bhaktapur in particular held out stubbornly, relying on its agricultural base and fortifications. Yet the pressure mounted year after year. Prithvi Narayan Shah's determination never wavered. He referred to Nepal as a yam between two stones, caught between the expanding British East India Company in the south and the Qing Empire in the north. To survive, Nepal had to be united, disciplined, and strong. Fragmentation would mean destruction. By 1768, the great project reached its climax. Prithvi Narayan Shah's forces captured Kantapur during the Indra Jatra festival. Panic spread through the valley. Lalitpur fell soon after, unable to resist without allies. Finally, in 1769, Bhaktapur was taken. The centuries of Malla rivalry ended in a single sweep of Gorkha's consolidation. The valley was unified and Nepal, as a kingdom, took form under Prithvi Narayan Shah's leadership. The rise of Gorkha was not the story of chance. It was the outcome of centuries of careful building. From Drevya Shah's seizure of a hill fort in 1559, to Ram Shah's principles of law, to the discipline of generations who prepared the kingdom for expansion. But it was Prithvi Narayan Shah's vision, his relentless pursuit of unity, and his mastery of war and politics that transformed a minor hill state into the nucleus of a nation. The Gorkha kingdom had risen, and with it, the idea of Nepal as one land, one authority, and one destiny. An idea forged not in peace, but in siege strategy, and the burning ambition of a single ruler who refused to see his kingdom remain small when the valley lay within reach. Prithvi Narayan Shah was not a king content with boundaries. From the moment he inherited the throne of Gorkha in 1743, he set his eyes on the Kathmandu Valley, the richest prize in the Himalayan foothills. The valley's three kingdoms, Kantapur, Lalitpur, and Bhaktapur, gleamed with temples, palaces, and trade wealth. Yet behind the splendor, they were fractured, locked in endless rivalry, unable to stand as one. He saw their weakness, and he turned it into opportunity. The first strike came in 1744 with Nuwakot, a fort city north of the valley. It was no ordinary prize. It was the gate to Tibet, a key link in the trans-Himalayan trade. To seize it was to choke Kathmandu's lifeline. His forces stormed the fort and captured it. Nuwakot was fortified immediately, making it Gorkha's forward base. From here, he could threaten the valley directly. But conquest was never easy. In 1757, Prithvi Narayan Shah attempted to march into the valley. The campaign collapsed. The armies of Kantapur, Lalitpur, and Bhaktapur, briefly united, pushed him back. Yet defeat did not break him. He withdrew, reorganized, tightened discipline, and studied his enemies again. He understood their strengths, vast resources, strong fortifications, but he also understood their fatal flaw. They would never stand united for long. His strategy shifted to attrition. He encircled the valley slowly, cutting off the arteries of trade. Gorkha forces captured Makwanpur in 1762 and Kirtipur in 1764. The fall of Kirtipur was especially brutal. The city resisted fiercely, inflicting heavy casualties on Gorkha troops. But when it finally fell, Prithvi Narayan Shah ordered the noses and lips of many defenders to be cut off, a punishment designed to terrify rivals. Ruthless, yes, but effective. The message was clear. Resistance carried a cost that would scar generations. The Valley Kings turned outward for help. Kantapur's rulers sought assistance from the British East India Company. In 1767, Captain Kinloch led an expedition from Patna with troops and supplies. But the campaign was a disaster. Gorkha's terrain, guerrilla tactics, and constant harassment broke the British advance. The East India Company retreated in humiliation, leaving the valley isolated. That failure sealed the Malla king's fate. No outside power would save them. Prithvi Narayan Shah tightened the noose. By 1768, the valley was starving. Trade routes from Tibet were blocked, supplies from the south intercepted. Caravans could not pass without Gorkha permission. Cities that had once thrived on commerce found their markets empty. Grain prices soared and desperation spread. The palaces still glittered, but famine gnawed at their foundations. Then came the final assault. In September 1768, Gorkha forces advanced on Kanipur. The timing was deliberate. It was the festival of Indra Jatra, when the city was absorbed in celebration. The defenses were thin. The attack was swift, overwhelming. Kanipur fell, and with it the prestige of the valley's central city collapsed. The shock rippled outward. Lalitpur surrendered soon after. Its rulers, deprived of allies, had no choice but to submit. Bhaktapur resisted, but the encirclement was total. In 1769, it too fell to Gorkha's armies. The Malla dynasty, which had ruled the valley for centuries, was broken. Their rivalries, once their pride, had been their undoing. With the valley under his control, Prithvi Narayan Shah declared a new order. He shifted his court to Kathmandu, making it the capital of a unified Nepal. For the first time, the fractured hill states and the wealthy valley cities were bound together under one crown. This was not just conquest, it was the birth of a kingdom. Prithvi Narayan Shah understood the stakes. Nepal was, as he described it, a yam between two stones, trapped between the Mughal-influenced plains of India to the south and the Qing Empire to the north. Survival demanded unity, vigilance, and independence. He banned the sale of land to foreigners, restricted external influence, and sought self-reliance in agriculture and trade. His policies were harsh but pragmatic. He knew that a divided Nepal would be swallowed by its neighbors. The unification was incomplete. Many regions of today's Nepal were not yet brought under Gorkha control, but the foundation had been set. From a small hill kingdom, Nepal had become a power in its own right, forged through siege, hunger, blood, and iron discipline. The valley that once shone with divided crowns now bowed to one authority, and the history of the Himalayas had entered a new and irreversible chapter. After the unification of the Kathmandu Valley, the Gorkha rulers did not stop. Expansion became policy. From the late 18th century into the early 19th, Nepal's armies marched westward, northward, and eastward, determined to transform a hill kingdom into a Himalayan power. Kemao fell to them in 1791, Garhwal followed in 1804, and by the early 1800s their authority extended into Sikkim. What had once been a fragmented cluster of principalities was now a formidable state stretching from the Thistha River in the east to the Kangra Valley in the west. The ambition was clear: control the Himalayan corridor, dominate trade routes, and secure the mountain passes against all rivals. This expansion, however, drew Nepal directly into the orbit of the British East India Company. The company, by then the master of Bengal, Bihar, and large swathes of northern India, viewed Nepal's rise with unease. The Gorkha state controlled the vital hill tracts overlooking the plains. From these ridges, they could threaten trade routes and potentially inspire rebellion among the hill tribes under British influence. For the British, the Himalayan frontier had to be stable, under their terms, not Nepal's. Border disputes escalated quickly. The fertile Terai Plains, rich in rice and vital for revenue, were claimed by both sides. Farmers often paid taxes to whichever power was nearest, and overlapping claims created constant tension. Skirmishes broke out, Nepalese garrisons pushing southward, British patrols resisting. Each confrontation widened the rift. By 1814, confrontation turned into open war. The Anglo-Nepalese War, known in Nepal as the Gorkha War, was unlike the campaigns the company had fought in the plains. Nepal's soldiers were hardened mountain fighters, used to steep terrain, thin air, and sudden strikes. The fortresses of Nalapani, Jaithak, Malan, and Makwanpur became names etched in the memory of both sides. The war began in November 1814. At Nalapani, Balbhadra Kunwar commanded barely 600 men and women against a British force of more than 3,000 under Major General Gillespie. For weeks, the defenders held out, repelling wave after wave of assaults. Gillespie himself was killed in the fighting. The British, frustrated and bloodied, resorted to cutting off the water supply. Only then did the Nepalese abandon the fort, walking out with their arms, refusing surrender. For the company, it was a victory soaked in humiliation. For Nepal, it was proof that discipline and resolve could defy an empire. But the war stretched across multiple fronts, and Nepal's resources were limited. In Garhwal, General Amar Singh Thapa, the veteran commander, resisted fiercely. His defenses at Malan Fort became legendary. British officers wrote of the difficulty of hauling cannons up sheer mountain ridges, only to be met by withering counterattacks. Yet numbers and supplies favored the company. By 1815, the pressure on Nepal was relentless. The war's brutality was not only in the battles, but also in the logistics. Thousands of porters carried supplies for both sides across impossible terrain. Casualties from disease and exhaustion rivaled those from combat. Yet the fighting continued, each side unwilling to concede. For the company, prestige was on the line. An Asian hill kingdom could not be allowed to resist. For Nepal, survival was everything. The turning point came with the capture of Almora in April 1815, cutting off Nepalese control over Kemu. Soon after, Amar Singh Thapa, facing overwhelming odds at Malan, accepted terms of surrender. Yet even in defeat, he refused dishonor, negotiating safe passage for his men. The British officers, impressed by his conduct, treated him with respect, a rare acknowledgement of an adversary's valor. Despite these losses, the war did not end immediately. In early 1816, fighting reached the gates of Makwanpur, close to the Kathmandu Valley itself. The threat of the capital falling forced Nepal to the negotiating table. On March 4, 1816, the Treaty of Sugauli was signed. Its terms were harsh. Nepal ceded Kemu, Garhwal, and all claims to Sikkim. The Mechi River in the east and the Mahakali River in the west became fixed borders, cutting away vast territories. The Terai Plains, too, were surrendered, lands essential for agriculture and tax revenue. Nepal, once a rising power pressing against the frontiers of India, was reduced to its present boundaries. Yet one clause defined the future. Nepal retained its sovereignty. Unlike Awadh, Mysore, or the Maratha states, it was not annexed. The Gorkha kingdom remained independent, though permanently shadowed by British power. The company installed a resident in Kathmandu, binding Nepal diplomatically, but it stopped short of direct rule. This outcome was no accident. The British, though victorious, had learned a painful lesson in mountain warfare. They respected Nepal's fighting ability, recognizing that occupation would drain men and money without end. The Nepalese soldiers they had fought so bitterly soon became their allies, recruited into the British Indian Army as the Gorkhas, famed for their loyalty and ferocity. For Nepal, the war left scars. Territory lost, pride wounded, but independence intact. The state that Prithvi Narayan Shah had forged was reduced in size, but not destroyed. Its rulers understood the new reality. Nepal would have to live as a small but sovereign power, balanced precariously between empires, guarded not by wealth or vast lands, but by the strength of its identity and the reputation of its warriors. Kathmandu was on edge. Court rivalries had sharpened into blades. Power had become a battlefield of whispers, betrayals, and assassins hidden in the shadows of the palace. The throne was fragile, the monarchy weak, and behind the veil of ritual, Nepal was waiting for someone ruthless enough to seize it all. That moment came on the night of September 14, 1846, the Kot massacre. Inside the armory courtyard, known as the Kot, nobles gathered at the command of Queen Raja Lakshmi, who sought vengeance for the murder of her confidant, General Gagan Singh. Torches lit the night, soldiers stood tense, and suspicion poisoned the air. Then chaos erupted. Jang Bahadur Kunwar, an ambitious military officer, stepped forward. When arguments spiraled into threats, his men raised their muskets. Shots cracked. Swords flashed. Blood spilled across the courtyard stones. Nearly 40 of Nepal's most powerful courtiers fell, killed in minutes. Rivals, who had guided the kingdom for generations, were wiped out in one calculated strike. The queen herself, stunned by the carnage she had unleashed, was stripped of power and exiled to Varanasi. The massacre that began as palace intrigue ended as a coup. From that night, Jang Bahadur ceased to be a mere officer. He became the master of Nepal. He declared himself prime minister, then made sure the office was his forever. In 1847, he assumed the title Maharaja of Kaski and Lamyong, binding his name to old principalities, and secured recognition from the crown. But he went further. He decreed that his position as prime minister would be hereditary. Power no longer flowed from the Shah kings. It flowed through Jang Bahadur and his lineage. Thus began the Rana regime, a century of autocratic rule, lasting from 1846 to 1951. The Shah kings remained, but only as figureheads, their signatures stamped under duress, their voices reduced to whispers in their own palaces. Jang Bahadur consolidated his grip with precision. He controlled the army, the only real instrument of power in Nepal. He staffed his administration with his brothers and cousins, weaving a dynasty where loyalty was bound by blood. No decision passed without his sanction. Land revenues, appointments, and punishments were decided by his hand. In 1850, Jang Bahadur did something unprecedented for a South Asian ruler of his time. He traveled to Britain and France. He met Queen Victoria, walked the streets of London, and studied European law, military organization, and industry. On his return to Nepal in 1851, he introduced the Maluki Ain, a comprehensive legal code. It systematized caste hierarchy, punishments, and rights, cementing social divisions but providing uniform governance. It was reform fused with control, modernization in structure, rigidity in society. Externally, Jang Bahadur pursued survival. He understood the fate of states swallowed by the British East India Company. To prevent Nepal from sharing that destiny, he aligned with Britain. When the Indian Rebellion of 1857 erupted, Jang Bahadur dispatched 9,000 Nepali troops to aid the British. Their loyalty was rewarded. Britain guaranteed Nepal's sovereignty, even returning portions of the Terai once lost in the Treaty of Sugauli. Nepal became an ally, not a conquest. But this alliance came at a price. Nepal's rulers adopted a strict isolationist policy. Foreign influence was carefully managed. Trade and contact were restricted. While India underwent industrial transformation under colonial rule, Nepal stagnated under the Ranas. Education was reserved for the elite. Roads and communication remained primitive by design. Isolation preserved independence, but it locked the country in a state of feudal hierarchy. Social order hardened. The caste system, reinforced by the Maluki Ain, dictated every layer of life. High castes dominated administration and landholding, while lower castes remained trapped in servitude. The monarchy, once a symbol of unity, was silenced. The Ranas ruled as hereditary prime ministers, not servants of the crown, but kings in all but name. Jang Bahadur died in 1877, but the dynasty he created endured. His brothers, nephews, and descendants ruled in succession, often through intrigue, exile, and assassination. The Shah kings continued to sit on the throne, crowned in elaborate rituals, yet powerless, spectators in their own kingdom. For ordinary Nepalis, the Rana era meant hierarchy and suppression. Taxes burdened peasants. Education was scarce. Printing presses were forbidden for decades. Ideas that stirred revolutions elsewhere in Asia were blocked at Nepal's borders. Roads connected garrisons and palaces, not villages and markets. Progress was filtered through the needs of the ruling family. Yet, the Ranas maintained one undeniable achievement: sovereignty. While neighbors became colonies, Nepal remained independent, its flag still raised above the Himalayas. But independence under autocracy carried its own weight: political stagnation, cultural control, and a society frozen in rigid order. The Khat massacre had not simply ended one faction's dominance. It had rewritten Nepal's structure of power. From 1846 onward, kings wore crowns without authority, and one family dictated the fate of millions. For a century, Nepal's history flowed through the narrow channel carved that night, when Jang Bahadur Rana's guns fired in the courtyard and reshaped the destiny of a kingdom forever. Europe ignited in war. Empires clashed across continents. In faraway Nepal, isolated, landlocked, ruled by the Rana regime, the call to arms reached the hills. Britain summoned the Gorkhas, the famed soldiers of Nepal, whose reputation for courage had been forged in the Anglo-Nepalese War a century earlier. The Ranas complied, and thus began one of the most defining chapters in Nepal's modern history. Tens of thousands of Nepali men left their villages for the trenches of the Western Front, the deserts of Mesopotamia, and the jungles of Burma. By the end of the First World War, 1914 to 1918, more than 200,000 Gurkhas had served under the British Crown. They fought at Gallipoli in 1915, where Ottoman gunfire mowed down ranks of Allied troops. They endured the mud and poison gas of France and Flanders, carrying kukkuris at their sides, curved blades that symbolized both fear and honor. Their bravery became legend. In Mesopotamia, they stormed enemy trenches with relentless force. At Lus, at Ypres, at the Somme, Gurkhas fought in battles that consumed thousands of lives in days. Casualties were staggering. Of the Nepali men who went to war in World War I, nearly 20,000 never returned. For the families left behind, the war meant empty fields, absent fathers, and broken households. Yet their sacrifice bound Nepal's fate more tightly to the British Empire. The Ranas leveraged this loyalty. Prime Minister Chandra Shumsher Rana supported Britain's cause not out of sympathy, but calculation. British recognition of Nepal's military contribution ensured continued independence. When the Treaty of Versailles was signed in 1919, Nepal was listed among the nations invited to the peace conference. For the first time, Nepal appeared on the world stage as a recognized sovereign state, not as a colony, but as an ally. 2 decades later, war came again. In 1939, Germany's invasion of Poland plunged the globe into conflict. Once more, the British turned to Nepal. By the end of the Second World War, 1939 to 1945, over 250,000 Gurkhas had served. They fought in North Africa against Rommel's Afrika Korps. They battled the Japanese in Burma, where the dense jungles and monsoon rains tested endurance beyond measure. At Impal and Kohima in 1944, Gurkhas played a decisive role in halting the Japanese advance into India. Their courage was not just noted, it was decorated. By the end of World War II, Gurkhas had won 2,734 bravery awards, including 12 Victoria Crosses, Britain's highest military honor. Stories spread across the Allied world of Gurkhas refusing to retreat, of men charging enemy lines with kukkuris drawn, of discipline and loyalty that seemed unbreakable. To Britain, the Gorkhas were indispensable. To the world, they became the embodiment of Nepal's martial spirit. But war always extracts a price. For Nepal, the cost was borne at home. Villages emptied of young men. Agriculture suffered. Families waited for years, only to receive news of sons and fathers buried in foreign soil. Those who returned brought wages, medals, and stories, but also trauma, wounds, and an unfamiliar sense of a wider world. Economically, remittances from service provided cash in a country starved of monetary circulation. Soldiers' pensions became lifelines for rural households. Some veterans returned with new ideas, glimpses of education, infrastructure, and freedom seen abroad. These small seeds would later challenge the stagnation of Rana rule. Politically, Nepal's role in the world wars elevated its standing. By siding with Britain, the Ranas ensured Nepal avoided colonization. Yet the very wars that preserved Nepal's sovereignty also exposed the contradictions of Rana autocracy. Nepali soldiers had fought for freedom in Europe and Asia, Yet their own homeland remained shackled under hereditary rulers who denied education, press, and political voice. Veterans returned questioning the order they had left behind. In Britain and India, the Gorkhas became symbols of loyalty. Winston Churchill himself declared that, "Without them, we would not have won the war." The world spoke of their valor, but the recognition was complex. Gorkhas were honored, yes, but always as soldiers of another empire. Nepal remained in the background, its independence guarded, its people silent, its rulers content to profit from the arrangement. The First and Second World Wars tied Nepal irreversibly into global history. They revealed the paradox of a small Himalayan kingdom, poor, isolated, autocratic, yet indispensable in battles fought oceans away. They etched the name Gorkha into international memory, and they carried consequences that stretched far beyond the battlefield. For when the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the soldiers who came home carried more than scars. They carried new visions that would one day shake the foundations of the Rana regime itself. The Second World War ended in 1945, but its aftershocks rattled every corner of the globe, and Nepal was no exception. The Rana regime, entrenched for a century since Jang Bahadur's coup of 1846, looked unshakable on the surface. The prime ministers ruled as hereditary autocrats, reducing kings to ceremonial figures and keeping the people voiceless. Yet beneath that facade, cracks had begun to widen. Nepali soldiers returning from distant battlefields brought home more than medals. They carried memories of democratic institutions in India, of parliaments in Britain, of leaders accountable to the public. They had fought in the name of freedom abroad, yet returned to find their homeland suffocated under a system where education was restricted, press was banned, and dissent meant exile or death. The contradictions were too great to ignore. By the late 1940s, democratic stirrings spread among students, workers, and political thinkers. Many operated from exile in India, where the air was charged with independent struggles. The Nepali Congress, founded in 1946 by leaders such as Vishveshvar Prasad Koirala, became the nucleus of this movement. Its members envisioned a Nepal free of Rana domination, guided by constitutional monarchy and people's rights. At the heart of this brewing storm stood King Tribhuvan. Born in 1906 and crowned in 1911, he had grown under the suffocating shadow of Rana authority. Unlike his predecessors, who bowed to the prime ministers, Tribhuvan quietly sympathized with democratic forces. By the late 1940s, he became their silent ally, a living symbol that the monarchy, long suppressed, could return as a balancing force. The Ranas, however, remained ruthless. Mohan Shumsher, the last Rana prime minister, believed the family's rule could endure by force. His government dismissed calls for reform, but history was moving faster than the Ranas could comprehend. The Indian independence of 1947 changed everything. A democratic India, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, would not indefinitely tolerate an autocratic regime on its northern border. Nepal's exiled revolutionaries now had a supportive stage from which to act. In November 1950, the storm broke. King Tribhuvan, refusing to serve as a pawn any longer, sought asylum in the Indian embassy in Kathmandu with his family. From there, he was flown to New Delhi, leaving the Ranas humiliated. In desperation, the Ranas installed Gyanendra, the young grandson of Tribhuvan, as king, a move that revealed their weakness. The people saw through it. Legitimacy lay with Tribhuvan, and his defiance emboldened resistance across Nepal. The Nepali Congress declared armed struggle. From the eastern hills, bands of fighters rose against Rana garrisons. Battles erupted in Biratnagar, Bhojpur, and beyond. The Ranas, accustomed to ruling through bureaucracy and palace intrigue, were unprepared for guerrilla warfare waged by citizens determined to end their century of domination. By early 1951, the situation reached breaking point. Neither side could claim total victory. The Ranas still controlled Kathmandu, but revolutionaries controlled much of the countryside. India stepped in as mediator. Nehru understood that stability in Nepal was vital for India's northern security. In February 1951, talks were held in New Delhi between King Tribhuvan, Nepali Congress leaders, and Rana representatives. The result was the Delhi Compromise. On February 18, 1951, King Tribhuvan returned to Kathmandu in triumph. Crowds filled the streets, hailing the end of Rana autocracy. The agreement restored the monarchy as an active power, created a coalition government with both Rana and Congress members, and set the path for democratic reform. Though imperfect, it shattered the Rana's monopoly. The century-old system, born in blood at the Khat massacre of 1846, collapsed under the weight of popular resistance and shifting geopolitics. The fall of the Ranas marked not only the restoration of monarchy, but the reawakening of Nepal itself. A society long silenced by hereditary rule had broken open. Veterans who had fought in foreign wars now saw change at home. Political parties, once scattered in exile, had forced their way into Kathmandu. The autocrats who had built palaces, taxed ruthlessly, and isolated Nepal from the modern world were finished. The revolution of 1951 did not answer every question. It opened them. Yet in that moment, Nepal crossed a line that could never be reversed. The revolution of 1951 had ended the century-long Rana domination, but what came after was not stability. It was uncertainty. Nepal had removed one chain, only to step into a maze. For the first time, a constitution was drafted, parties formed, and elections promised. The idea of parliamentary democracy entered Kathmandu, but it entered a country that had no history of such institutions, no widespread education, and no clear consensus on what democracy should look like. The 1950s were years of turbulence. In 1959, Nepal held its first general election. The Nepali Congress, led by Bishveshvar Prasad Koirala, secured a decisive victory. On May 27, 1959, King Mahendra inaugurated the elected parliament, handing over power to a prime minister chosen by the people. It was a milestone, yet fragile. BP Koirala's government lasted only 18 months. He pushed reforms that directly challenged entrenched powers. Land reform threatened landlords. Efforts to modernize education and administration created friction with traditional elites. Even within the Congress, rivalries fractured unity. Bureaucrats, long accustomed to Rana-style authoritarianism, resisted the shift. The army remained loyal to the king, not to parliament. Every decision seemed to sharpen fault lines rather than heal them. King Mahendra, son of Tribhuvan, watched closely. Born in 1920, educated in both Nepal and India, he had witnessed his father's alliance with democratic forces, but also the instability that followed. To him, the system seemed unworkable. The Congress, in his view, was divided, inefficient, and too aligned with India's influence. Mahendra believed Nepal's survival required centralized authority, not imported models of governance. On December 15, 1960, he struck. In a sudden move, Mahendra dissolved parliament, dismissed Koirala's government, and imprisoned political leaders. Tanks rolled through Kathmandu, communications were cut, and the dream of democracy collapsed overnight. Mahendra justified his actions as a royal coup to save the nation from corruption and instability. The Constitution of 1959 was suspended. A new path was announced, the Panchayat system. The Panchayat was presented as partyless democracy. In theory, it claimed to empower the people by removing divisive political parties. In reality, it centralized all power under the monarchy. A four-tiered structure was built: village panchayats, district panchayats, zonal panchayats, and finally the Rastriya Panchayat at the national level. Every representative swore loyalty to the king. The army, the courts, the bureaucracy, all were brought under the palace's direct control. For ordinary Nepalis, it was a contradiction. Elections were held, but only within the partyless framework. Candidates could not represent political parties. Dissent was suppressed. Politicians like BP Koirala spent years in prison or exile. The press remained censored. Political freedom, briefly tasted after 1951, was once again stifled. Yet Mahendra framed the system as uniquely Nepali. He argued that Western-style parliamentary democracy had failed, that Nepal's rural, illiterate population could not sustain it. Panchayat, he said, reflected traditional values of consensus, loyalty, and hierarchy. His rhetoric carried weight. Many rural Nepalis, far from Kathmandu politics, saw little change in their daily struggles and remained passive. Foreign powers reacted cautiously. India, having supported democracy in Nepal, was unsettled by Mahendra's coup, but reluctant to intervene directly. China, meanwhile, welcomed stronger ties with the monarchy as it sought influence in the Himalayas after annexing Tibet in 1950. Mahendra skillfully balanced both neighbors, playing one against the other to secure Nepal's sovereignty. The 1960s and 1970s became decades of royal dominance. The Panchayat system institutionalized loyalty to the king through rituals, education, and state propaganda. Schools taught reverence for the Shah monarchy. The police monitored dissent. Political prisoners filled jails. The system appeared stable, yet beneath it, opposition simmered. Exiled leaders organized from India. Underground groups distributed pamphlets. Students staged protests, often crushed with force. King Mahendra's sudden death in 1972 brought his son, King Birendra, to the throne. The Panchayat continued under him, refined but not dismantled. By then, it had become the structure of governance for an entire generation. Nepal's parliament was no longer a place of free debate, but an echo chamber where loyalty was rewarded and dissent silenced. For 3 decades, Nepal lived under this model, a system that called itself democratic but denied political parties, centralized authority in the monarchy, and kept the public at arm's length. The experiment with parliamentary democracy in the 1950s had been short-lived, but its memory lingered. It was suppressed, censored, and criminalized, yet never erased. The Panchayat system had ruled for 30 years, but by the late 1980s, its grip was cracking. Economic stagnation deepened resentment. Students filled the streets. Political exiles pressed harder from abroad. Even rural villages, once silent, began to murmur. The king's claim that partyless rule was uniquely Nepali no longer convinced the people. The spark came in 1990. Political parties banned for decades resurfaced with force. The Nepali Congress, led by Ganesh Man Singh and Krishna Prasad Bhattarai, joined hands with the United Left Front, a coalition of communist parties. For years these groups had been divided, but now they united under one banner, the demand for multi-party democracy. From February to April 1990, protests spread like wildfire. Kathmandu became a battlefield of slogans, barricades, and police crackdowns. Security forces fired on demonstrators. Dozens were killed, hundreds injured. Yet repression only strengthened the movement. The streets refused to empty. Students, workers, and professionals all risked their lives to demand change. King Birendra, who had inherited the throne after his father Mahendra's death in 1972, watched his rule unravel. Unlike his father, Birendra was more cautious, more hesitant to shed blood. On April 9, 1990, he bowed to pressure. The ban on political parties was lifted. A new interim constitution was drafted. Nepal became a constitutional monarchy with multi-party democracy. But democracy came into a country deeply unequal. Land remained concentrated in the hands of a few. Villages lacked roads, schools, hospitals. Corruption tainted politics. The promise of 1990 soon met disillusionment. Out of this frustration, a new force emerged, the Maoists. On February 13, 1996, the Communist Party of Nepal Maoist, led by Pushpa Kamal Dahal, known as Prakanda, launched an armed insurgency. Their demand was radical: abolish the monarchy, dismantle feudal structures, and build a people's republic. What began with attacks on police posts in Ralpa and Rukam spread across the countryside. The state underestimated them at first. But within years, the Maoists controlled vast stretches of rural Nepal. They set up parallel administrations, collected taxes, and ran people's courts. For villagers long ignored by Kathmandu, they offered justice, swift, though often brutal. The army and police fought back, But the insurgency grew. The civil war tore Nepal apart from 1996 to 2006. Over 17,000 people were killed. Thousands disappeared. Villages were burned. Families displaced. The conflict reached even the heart of the capital. For the first time in modern history, the authority of Kathmandu was openly challenged in every corner of the country. Then came June 1, 2001, a night that shook the nation. Inside the Narayan Shah royal palace, Crown Prince Dipendra allegedly opened fire during a family gathering. King Birendra, Queen Aishwarya, and several royal family members were killed. The massacre stunned Nepal. Dipendra was declared king while in a coma, only to die days later. His uncle, Gyanendra, ascended the throne. But suspicion lingered. Many Nepalis doubted the official version of events. The massacre shattered faith in the monarchy, a faith already weakened by war. King Gyanendra ruled with an iron hand, dissolving parliament and dismissing elected governments. By 2005, he declared direct royal rule, claiming politicians had failed to end the insurgency. Instead of restoring order, Gyanendra provoked fury. Political parties, civil society, and the Maoists, once enemies, now aligned against him. The streets filled again, as they had in 1990. In April 2006, the People's Movement, Loktantra Andolan, paralyzed the country. For 19 days, millions protested despite curfews and bullets. Dozens were killed, but the tide was unstoppable. On April 24, 2006, Gyanendra gave in. Parliament was restored. The king's absolute powers were stripped. The monarchy, once the pillar of Nepal's identity, was reduced to a ceremonial role. What began in 1990 as a demand for democracy had now become a struggle to end monarchy itself. The civil war formally ended later that year with the Comprehensive Peace Accord signed on November 21, 2006. The Maoists agreed to lay down arms and join mainstream politics. The decade-long war had cost lives, but it had also dismantled the old order. The Shah monarchy, which had ruled since Prithvi Narayan Shah's conquest of the Kathmandu Valley in 1768, stood on the edge of extinction. In the shadow of the 2006 People's Movement, Nepal stood at a crossroads. Centuries of monarchy had been stripped of legitimacy. The palace massacre of 2001 had shattered its sanctity. King Gyanendra's direct rule had extinguished its credibility. By the time Parliament returned in April 2006, the monarchy was a hollow throne. The call for a republic grew louder with every protest, every debate, every headline. On December 28, 2007, the interim parliament declared Nepal a federal democratic republic in principle. The final blow came on May 28, 2008, when the newly elected Constituent Assembly gathered inside the Birendra International Convention Center in Kathmandu. Out of 601 members, 560 voted for abolition. Only 4 dared to oppose. The verdict was thunderous. After 240 years, the Shah monarchy was gone. King Gyanendra left Narayan Shah Palace quietly, without ceremony, reduced to a citizen of the very republic that had dismantled his dynasty. The birth of the Federal Democratic Republic of Nepal was unprecedented in South Asia. It was not only the end of a royal line, but the beginning of a state rebuilt on the ashes of monarchy and civil war. Power no longer belonged to a single crown. It was to be divided among elected representatives, provinces, and local bodies. For the first time, the map of Nepal would be redrawn from a unitary state into a federal structure. But the triumph of 2008 was followed immediately by struggle. The Constituent Assembly, tasked with drafting a new constitution within 2 years, was pulled in every direction. The Maoists, the largest party after the 2008 election, demanded a people's republic with radical land reform and restructuring. The Nepali Congress and the UML favored a parliamentary model with checks and balances. Ethnic and regional groups pushed for identity-based federalism, demanding provinces drawn along cultural and linguistic lines. Debate turned to deadlock. Between 2008 and 2012, the Assembly's term was extended 4 times. Drafts were written and scrapped. Protests erupted on the streets, Madhisi movements in the southern plains, indigenous groups in the hills, students in the cities. Each demanded recognition, autonomy, dignity. For many, federalism was not simply about governance. It was about correcting centuries of exclusion by the Kathmandu elite. Meanwhile, the Maoist fighters, who had lived with rifles in the jungles of Ralpa and Rukam, now faced disarmament. Under the 2006 peace accord, around 19,000 registered Maoist combatants were confined to cantonments across the country. Their future became a burning question. Would they be integrated into the national army or demobilized into civilian life? Negotiations dragged on. Distrust ran deep. The Nepal army resisted absorbing large numbers of former rebels. The Maoists accused their rivals of betraying promises. Only in 2012 did the process end, with around 1,400 Maoist fighters integrated into the army and the rest opting for voluntary retirement with cash packages. Political instability haunted the republic from its very birth. Between 2008 and 2015, Nepal saw rapid changes of government. Prime ministers rose and fell within months. The Maoist leader Prakanda resigned in 2009 after a clash with the president over the army chief. Madhav Kumar Nepal, Jalanath Kanal, Baburam Bhattarai all cycled through office as coalition governments fractured again and again. Each collapse delayed the constitution. Each delay deepened public frustration. Then, on May 27, 2012, the First Constituent Assembly dissolved after failing to deliver a constitution. It was the longest assembly in Nepal's history, and it ended without fulfilling its central mandate. For many Nepalis, it was a devastating moment. Years of sacrifice in war and protest seemed to dissolve into political stalemate. Yet the dream of a republic could not be abandoned. A second Constituent Assembly was elected in November 2013, this time dominated by the Nepali Congress and UML, with Maoists reduced to third place. Even then, consensus was elusive. The fault lines over federalism sharpened. Should provinces be drawn on the basis of identity, Madhisi, Tharu, Janajati, or should they be neutral administrative units? The debate split the country. In the Terai, Madhisi parties organized massive demonstrations demanding autonomy. In the hills, other groups opposed what they saw as the balkanization of the nation. The negotiations dragged on until disaster struck. On April 25, 2015, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake devastated Nepal. Nearly 9,000 people were killed. Hundreds of thousands lost homes. Ancient temples collapsed into dust. The catastrophe jolted the political class into action. The need for stability, reconstruction, and unity became urgent. Suddenly, compromise seemed possible. Within months, leaders of the major parties, Nepali Congress, UML, and Maoists, reached agreement. On September 20, 2015, Nepal promulgated its new constitution. The country was declared a federal democratic republic with 7 provinces. Sovereignty rested with the people. The monarchy was permanently abolished. The republic had, at last, a legal foundation. But challenges only multiplied. Madhisi and Thara groups in the Terai rejected the constitution, arguing that provincial boundaries marginalized their identity and rights. Protests swept the plains, and in late 2015, a blockade at the India-Nepal border crippled supplies of fuel and medicine. Tensions flared between Kathmandu and New Delhi, adding a geopolitical dimension to the struggle. Despite these fractures, the republic moved forward. Elections were held in 2017 under the new constitution, for local bodies, provincial assemblies, and federal parliament. For the first time, Nepal had a 3-tiered democratic structure functioning simultaneously. Former rebels sat in parliament alongside monarchists and centrists. Women and marginalized groups entered politics in greater numbers, bolstered by quotas in the constitution. Yet instability remained constant. Governments rose and fell through shifting coalitions. The Supreme Court frequently intervened to settle constitutional disputes. Corruption scandals eroded public trust. Federalism, though established, faced challenges of implementation. Provinces lacked resources. Bureaucracies resisted decentralization. and boundaries remained contested. Still, the abolition of monarchy in 2008 marked an irreversible transformation. What had once been a Himalayan kingdom under a sacred crown was now a republic defined by ballots, assemblies, and constitutions. The struggle to build it was messy, chaotic, and unfinished. But it was also relentless, driven by generations who refused to accept silence, hierarchy, and exclusion. From the ruins of kingship and civil war, a federal democratic republic had emerged, and with it, the unending battle to define what kind of nation Nepal would become. The 21st century confronted Nepal with its greatest trials and its most uncertain promises. On April 25, 2015, at 11:56 a.m., the ground beneath central Nepal split with a violence not seen in generations. A 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck near Gorkha, northwest of Kathmandu. In less than a minute, entire towns were reduced to rubble. Centuries-old temples crumbled into dust. More than 8,900 people lost their lives, nearly 22,000 were injured, and over 600,000 houses were destroyed. Kathmandu, Durbar Square, Bhaktapur, Patan, centers of Malla brilliance, lay shattered. The Darahara Tower, once a proud landmark of the capital, collapsed completely, burying hundreds. The aftershocks refused to relent. On May 12, 2015, a second quake, this time 7.3 magnitude, hit eastern Nepal. Villages in Sindipalchik and Dalaka were flattened. Roads cracked. Mountainsides gave way. The disaster left more than 3.5 million people homeless, their livelihoods crushed, their histories buried beneath stone and mud. In rural hills, families lived for months under tarpaulin tents, exposed to monsoon rains. The world sent aid, but the sheer devastation overwhelmed even the most ambitious reconstruction plans. The National Reconstruction Authority was set up in December 2015, but rebuilding was slow. Corruption, political instability, and bureaucratic delays meant that years later, tens of thousands still struggled in temporary shelters. The scars of the earthquake were not only physical, they were political. The disaster became a test of the newly formed federal republic, and many Nepalis saw in its failures the weaknesses of their fragile system. Even as Nepal rebuilt, it had to navigate the dangerous balance of geopolitics. Landlocked between India and China, Nepal has always been a chessboard for influence. After the earthquake, India was among the first to send rescue teams and relief supplies. But by late 2015, tensions flared. The promulgation of the new constitution on September 20, 2015 triggered protests in the Maids region, where groups felt marginalized by the new provincial boundaries. Demonstrators blocked the border points. India, citing security concerns, halted fuel and essential supplies. Nepalis called it an unofficial blockade, lasting from September 2015 to February 2016. Lines for fuel stretched for kilometers in Kathmandu. Hospitals ran short of medicine. The blockade, following so closely after the earthquake, deepened anti-Indian sentiment and pushed Nepal closer to China. In March 2016, Nepal signed major agreements with Beijing for fuel and trade diversification. Roads through the Himalayas were planned, air routes expanded, and Nepal officially joined China's Belt and Road Initiative in 2017. Yet geography remained decisive. Most of Nepal's trade still passed through India, and the open border remained a lifeline for millions of Nepali workers seeking employment. The state learned painfully that balancing its two giant neighbors was not optional. It was survival. Politics at home remained turbulent. The 2017 elections, the first under the new constitution, produced a leftist alliance between the Communist Party of Nepal, Unified Marxist-Leninist, and the Maoist Center. Together they formed the Nepal Communist Party, led initially by K.P. Sharma Ali. For a moment, it seemed stability had arrived. A strong government with a nearly two-thirds majority promised infrastructure, federalism, and economic growth. Yet, by 2020, factional struggles split the party apart. In 2021, the Supreme Court invalidated its merger, returning the UML and Maoists to separate entities. Once again, coalition politics dictated governance. Federalism itself remained an unfinished project. 7 provinces had been created, but boundaries were contested, resources scarce, and power still concentrated in Kathmandu. Provincial governments demanded more autonomy but lacked funds. Madhisi parties in Province 2 pushed for greater recognition of their rights, while indigenous groups in the hills demanded cultural federalism. What had been envisioned as a system of inclusion often stumbled under the weight of mistrust and competition. Economically, Nepal struggled to find footing. The earthquake had destroyed infrastructure, but even before that, growth was fragile. Agriculture, still employing more than half the population, remained underdeveloped. Remittances became Nepal's backbone. By the 2010s, they accounted for over 25% of GDP, as millions of Nepalis worked in the Gulf states, Malaysia, and India. This brought foreign currency, but also dependence. Whole villages in western Nepal were emptied of young men, leaving only the elderly and children behind. Tourism, long a pillar of the economy, faced repeated shocks. The earthquake had devastated trekking routes, including the Everest region. Just as recovery was underway, the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 shut down global travel. Flights stopped. Hotels emptied. The economy contracted sharply by 2.4% in 2020, the steepest fall in decades. Lockdowns exposed weaknesses in healthcare and governance. Millions of migrant workers were stranded abroad, many returning home jobless. Yet once restrictions eased, Nepali workers again departed in vast numbers, proof of the structural dependence on foreign labor. Even in crisis, tradition and identity held fierce sway. The annual rituals of the Newars in the Kathmandu Valley, the Gurung and Magar festivals in the hills, the Madhisi celebrations in the Terai, each carried forward the memory of centuries. Nepal's cultural mosaic remained both a source of pride and of contention. Identity politics often sharpened divisions, especially in debates about federalism and representation, but also kept alive the richness that monarchy and war had failed to erase. In foreign policy, Nepal sought balance with caution. Prime ministers alternated between visits to Delhi and Beijing, signing agreements with one and assuring friendship with the other. India funded hydropower projects and roads. China built infrastructure, including the Pokhara International Airport, inaugurated in 2023. The United States pushed the Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact, signed in 2017 but ratified only in 2022 after intense political debate. Each step reflected Nepal's delicate position, too small to dictate terms, too proud to accept subordination. The people, however, measured governance less by diplomacy than by delivery. Roads, electricity, jobs, healthcare, these remained the constant demands. Corruption scandals, frequent government changes, and weak implementation eroded public trust. Federalism promised empowerment, but for many, its benefits felt distant. Young Nepalis increasingly sought futures abroad, while those who stayed oscillated between frustration and resilience. The earthquake had exposed the fragility of Nepal's foundations, both physical and political. The blockade had revealed the vulnerabilities of dependence. The pandemic underscored the costs of weak systems. Yet through it all, the republic endured. The monarchy did not return. The constitution, though contested, remained in force. Elections continued, producing governments that rose and fell, but always within the framework of the republic. Nepal in the 21st century is a nation suspended between mountains and borders, between tradition and modernization, between instability and resilience. Its people have carried the weight of monarchy, civil war, earthquakes, and blockades, yet they continue to build, protest, and demand. The republic may still be fragile, but it exists shaped by every disaster, every uprising, every debate. And as the century moves forward, Nepal stands as both a survivor of history and a nation still writing it.